On December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 departed from JFK Airport in New York. Headed for Miami, it was supposed to be a routine flight, a simple journey for the 163 passengers and crew. The weather was clear, the skies were calm, and everything appeared to be in perfect order. The flight crew, led by Captain Robert Loft, a seasoned veteran with a stellar reputation for safety and professionalism, had nothing to suggest that this flight would be any different from the countless others he had piloted. Alongside him was First Officer Albert John Stimson and Flight Engineer Donald Repo. Their bond, built over years of flying together, added a sense of familiarity and confidence to the flight, reassuring everyone aboard that they were in capable hands. But then something went terribly wrong. A minor malfunction with the landing gear indicator light sparked a sense of urgency in the cockpit. The light, designed to signal whether the landing gear was properly deployed, began flickering. It wasn't a critical issue, but it was enough to unsettle the crew. For Captain Loft, who had spent decades in the skies, the flickering light became an obsession. His attention to detail, though admirable, turned into a singular focus. The more he stared at the malfunctioning indicator, the more it consumed him. As the aircraft cruised over the Everglades, the crew became increasingly distracted by the technical issue. This decision, seemingly trivial at the time, would soon prove to be a fatal mistake. Captain Loft and First Officer Stimson leaned over the instrument panel, attempting to resolve the issue. Meanwhile, Flight Engineer Repo, seated beside them, had been trying to help when something unprecedented occurred. In the midst of their distraction, the autopilot was disengaged, unnoticed by the crew. Slowly, the aircraft began to descend, its descent almost imperceptible at first. The steady hum of the engines continued. The flight attendants moved down the aisles serving passengers, and all appeared well. But in the cockpit, the pilots were too absorbed in their work to realize that the plane was dropping. The aircraft, unknowingly to the crew, was falling toward the earth. A sudden jolt sent shockwaves through the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was happening. The crew, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, continued to focus on the indicator light. As the plane continued its descent into the darkness of the night, panic began to creep in. The aircraft crashed into the thick Everglades, its descent ending with a deafening impact followed by an eerie silence that only the survivors would ever truly understand. Out of the 163 people aboard, 101 perished. The survivors were left to grapple with the nightmare that had unfolded. Among the dead were the 3 flight crew members, Captain Loft, First Officer Stimson, and Flight Engineer Repo. They had been at the controls, the last to understand the true peril they were in. The crash wasn't caused by a mechanical failure or an explosion. It was the result of human error, a tragic lapse in judgment that sealed their fate. The wreckage was scattered across the Everglades, and the survivors were airlifted out, many severely injured. Survival, however, brought no relief, only the haunting truth of the night that claimed so many lives. But this was far from the end of the story. In the aftermath, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, began its investigation. The official cause of the accident was determined to be pilot error, stemming from the crew's distraction with the landing gear indicator. But what was left out of the official report were the strange occurrences that began soon after the crash. Flight 401 wasn't just a tragedy. It evolved into something far more mysterious. It became a legend. As the survivors began to heal, many reported unsettling experiences that couldn't be explained. It wasn't just trauma or hallucinations. They saw things that shouldn't have been there. The faces of the deceased flight crew, Captain Loft, First Officer Stimson, and Flight Engineer Repo, seemed to linger long after the crash had ended. Some of the flight attendants, after recovering, spoke of seeing the ghosts of the deceased crew members on other flights. These weren't just figments of their imagination, they were fully formed apparitions, interacting with the living as though they had never left. The figures of Captain Loft, First Officer Stimson, and Flight Engineer Repo were seen walking through the aisles of planes that had no connection to the ill-fated Flight 401. The reports began to spread. Soon, it wasn't just the survivors telling their stories. Other pilots and flight crews began to recount similar encounters. Flight attendants reported hearing voices in the galley when they were alone, voices that sounded hauntingly familiar. Some even spoke of feeling an eerie presence near the cockpit door when they were alone at their stations. But the most disturbing encounters involved the flight engineers. It was said that the spirits of Loft, Stimson, and Repo would appear in the galley or cockpit, quietly offering assistance in ways that were strangely familiar. One particularly unsettling story came from a flight crew member who had been part of a flight after the crash. He recounted walking into the galley only to freeze when he saw a figure standing in the shadows. At first, the figure was unrecognizable, but then it stepped into the light. It was flight engineer Repo, his face frozen in a concentrated expression. He had been dead for months, yet there he stood, as though the crash had never happened. Other reports followed. Passengers spoke of sudden cold spots in the cabin's areas that would inexplicably chill, as though a ghostly presence was near. Some even claimed to have seen the crew members' faces staring out of windows on darkened planes, their eyes fixed on them, as if silently watching over them. As the story spread, rumors began to grow. The haunting of Flight 401 was no longer just a tale, it had transformed into a phenomenon. The crew and passengers weren't merely haunted by the crash. They were haunted by the very people who had perished. It was as if the souls of the deceased flight crew had remained trapped in the planes they once flew, unable to move on. And then came the unsettling truth. The spirits of Flight 401 weren't just lingering as passive observers. They had a purpose, and it wasn't simply to witness the tragedy. The spirits had a reason for their presence, and their message was far more urgent than anyone had anticipated. As the haunting stories of Flight 401 spread throughout the aviation world, it became apparent that the spirits of the flight crew were far from passive observers. They were actively involved in the strange phenomena that began to unfold. Strange occurrences that reached far beyond the survivors and flight attendants. It wasn't just a handful of witnesses anymore. The entire aviation community had started to experience inexplicable events. With each new testimony, the mystery deepened, and each report seemed more chilling than the last. One of the earliest incidents that truly captivated the public's attention was the eerie appearance of the deceased crew members aboard other Eastern Airlines flights. It wasn't just fleeting glimpses or shadowy figures. These apparitions were seen at work, actively interacting with the living in ways no one could explain. Initially, these sightings were dismissed as the result of overactive imaginations. After all, the witnesses had been through a traumatic experience, and the human mind, under such stress, could easily trick itself. But as the stories kept coming, it became harder to dismiss. Some of the flight crews reported receiving assistance during flights from the apparitions, as if the spirits of the deceased crew members were guiding them from beyond the grave. One of the most persistent and unsettling encounters involved the ghost of flight engineer Repo. His spectral presence was often reported in the cockpits of various Eastern Airlines planes. What made these sightings particularly unnerving wasn't just the fact that Repo was dead, but the way in which he interacted with the living crew. Flight crews, who had never met him, would describe his voice, his mannerisms, and his attention to detail all the same as they had been when he was alive. In one particularly eerie account, a flight attendant from another flight recalled a night when the crew was struggling with a complicated mechanical issue. The pilot, unsure of what steps to take, made a desperate radio call to the ground crew. But before the communication could come through, the problem was miraculously resolved. The crew had no idea how it had happened. Later, when the flight attendant spoke to the captain about the mysterious resolution, he simply remarked, "It was as if someone had been sitting right there with us, guiding us through it." The flight attendant, her skin crawling, looked around and saw something that froze her in place. The figure of a man, standing silently in the corner of the cockpit. The man was none other than flight engineer Repo, his form barely visible but unmistakable. But it wasn't only the spirits of the crew members that were seen. Other strange manifestations began to occur, each more disturbing than the last. Pilots and flight attendants began to report an unexplainable weight in the air, a heaviness that would settle over the cabin or cockpit without warning. Others heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing in empty corridors, shoes shuffling on the floors of planes that were otherwise vacant. One particularly chilling testimony came from a captain who was flying a different Eastern Airlines plane several months after the crash. He was in the cockpit performing a routine check when suddenly a cold draft swept through the cabin. Looking up from his instruments, he noticed the temperature had dropped significantly. As he turned to his co-pilot, a sudden pressure on his chest made it hard to breathe. "What the hell?" he muttered, before his gaze froze on something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood by the cockpit door motionless, silent, and watching him. At first, the figure appeared to be a flight attendant, but something was off. The uniform looked old, the features blurry, and the face flickered in and out of view. The captain squinted, focusing on the insignia on the uniform, the faded gold eagle that marked Eastern Airlines. In that moment, he recognized the figure. It was Captain Loft, the man who had died in the crash months earlier. The captain couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The figure stood there, locked in place, watching him for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the pressure on his chest lifted, the temperature in the cockpit returned to normal, and the figure slowly faded into nothingness. As the years passed, the apparitions of Flight 401 grew from a mysterious phenomenon to an unsettling obsession, a story that everyone seemed to know but no one fully understood. But it wasn't just the ghosts of the flight crew that lingered. Something far deeper was at play. The strange occurrences, the vivid apparitions, and the unexplainable phenomena seemed tied to the very essence of Flight 401 itself. Some survivors began to report visions of the wreckage, the mangled remains of the plane, deep in the Everglades. These weren't just fleeting memories or imagined scenes. These were incredibly vivid visions of the crash site. Survivors described the twisted metal, the scattered debris, and the lifeless bodies strewn across the swampy ground. Some even spoke of seeing parts of the plane still smoldering, despite the fact that the fire had been extinguished long ago. What made these visions so unsettling was that some survivors saw details they couldn't have possibly known. They described aspects of the wreckage-specific pieces of debris, the precise position of the bodies that had never been revealed to the public. These were details that could only have been known by the investigators who had combed through the crash site. It wasn't just the survivors who experienced these visions. Passengers from other flights that had nothing to do with Flight 401 reported similar experiences. They often described the sensation of being at the crash site as if they had somehow witnessed the disaster firsthand, even though they hadn't. It was as if the tragic end of Flight 401 had left an imprint, a shadow that followed those who had been touched by it. Even more unnerving was the fact that some of the encounters with the ghosts of the flight crew seemed to carry a message. Flight attendants who had interacted with the spirits of Captain Loft, First Officer Stimson, and Flight Engineer Repo reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness in their presence. There was no malice, no anger, only sorrow. The spirits seemed trapped in a moment, unable to move on. And yet there were whispers that the crew members weren't simply lingering as lost souls. They weren't trapped in the past just because of the crash. Some believed the spirits were trying to warn the living, trying to protect them from something much darker. The crew members' inability to rest seemed tied to something deeper, something sinister. Some speculated that the flight itself had been a warning about a greater, more ominous force yet to be revealed. As the sightings continued, a pattern began to emerge. Flight 401 seemed to have become a gateway, a connection between the living and the dead. Those who flew on planes where the apparitions appeared spoke of feeling a strange connection to the lost souls of the flight. It was as though they were bound to the crash, tied to something that had been left unfinished, something unresolved. And then came the most unsettling theory of all. What if Flight 401 hadn't just been a tragic accident? What if it was something darker, something more ominous? The truth, it seemed, was far beyond the reach of the living. The haunting of Flight 401, now infamous within the aviation community, had grown into an obsession. The eerie encounters, the unsettling sightings, and the unexplained phenomena were happening more frequently, growing more disturbing by the day. The flight crews of Eastern Airlines weren't just haunted by ghosts. They were being drawn into something far more complex than anyone could have ever imagined. Whispers of something darker, something unfinished, grew louder with each passing year. The spirits of Captain Loft, First Officer Stimson, and Flight Engineer Repo were not lingering passively in the world of the living. They were trying to communicate something important, something that needed to be understood. But what was it? What was the connection between the living, the dead, and the crash? Was there a purpose behind it all, or was it simply the work of lost souls? The answer, it seemed, lay within one of the most chilling encounters of all. A former flight attendant who had flown on several planes after the crash came forward with an experience that would change everything. She spoke of a night she would never forget, an encounter with the spirit of Captain Loft that sent shockwaves through her, and ultimately the aviation community. It was a quiet evening, just another routine flight on an Eastern Airlines jet. The low hum of the engines filled the cabin, the only sound breaking the otherwise still air. The flight attendants had just completed their service and were heading back to the galley when something unusual happened. The plane, which had been cruising smoothly through the sky, suddenly jolted. It wasn't turbulence, it wasn't mechanical failure. The entire cabin shook, and an inexplicable sensation filled the air. The attendant, perplexed, glanced toward the cockpit, instinctively reaching for the intercom to inquire if everything was okay. Before she could even ask, she felt it, the presence. Standing in the doorway of the cockpit was Captain Loft. His face was pale, and his expression unreadable, but it was unmistakably him. The flight attendant froze, unable to speak. There was something about his presence, something eerie in the way he stood there, motionless, his eyes locked on her as though he were waiting for her to say something. It was suffocating, overwhelming, and despite the stillness, it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. Her heart raced, her breath quickened, and the air around her grew heavy. She had seen many things in her years of service, but nothing like this. She wanted to move, to call for help, but fear gripped her. The silence was deafening. And then Captain Loft spoke. "Don't ignore the warning," he whispered, his voice low but filled with urgency, an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. The flight attendant struggled to process his words. The chill in the air intensified, settling in her mind as his message echoed. Warning? What warning? What was he trying to convey? Before she could respond, the figure of Captain Loft faded, his form dissolving into the air as if he had never been there. The heavy atmosphere lifted from the cabin, and the plane seemed to return to its normal rhythm. But the words, the warning, burned into her mind. The warning, she realized, wasn't just for her, it was for all of them. For all the crew members who had flown these planes. The spirits of Flight 401 weren't just trying to linger in the shadows. They were trying to tell the living something far more significant than just the tragedy of the crash. There was something they had witnessed, something they knew, that had been kept hidden from everyone. But what was it? This encounter reverberated through the aviation community. It wasn't just another ghost story or unexplained apparition. This was something deeper. More accounts surfaced, and many flight crews, both past and present, began to speak out about the warning they had received from the ghostly crew of Flight 401. It wasn't just about mechanical issues or mid-flight emergencies. It was about something darker, something far more sinister. A hidden connection started to emerge from the wreckage of Flight 401, a connection buried beneath the tragedy of the crash. Something had been left unresolved, and the spirits of Flight 401 couldn't rest until the truth was revealed. What had they seen before the crash? What did they know that no one else understood? Theories began to circulate, and the most chilling theory of all pointed toward a secret, the kind of secret that Eastern Airlines had worked hard to keep hidden. Word spread that just days before the ill-fated flight, Captain Loft and his crew had been asked to test a newly modified aircraft system. The modifications had been rushed through without proper checks, and the system was said to be untested in real-world conditions. Some insiders whispered that this malfunctioning system of fault never fully disclosed to the public was the root cause of the crash, but this was just the beginning. What truly raised suspicions was the idea that Eastern Airlines had been attempting to cover up the fact that the plane was in far worse condition than anyone had realized. Had the crew been aware of the system's flaws? Were they unknowingly walking into a death trap, one that would ultimately lead to their demise? The whispers of the airline's mismanagement grew louder, but the truth remained locked in darkness. And then something even more disturbing occurred. Several years after the crash, a group of former flight attendants gathered for a reunion. They shared stories, laughed over old memories, and reminisced about their time together. But as the night wore on, the conversation inevitably turned to Flight 401, the ghost sightings, the strange occurrences, the warnings. They had heard the stories, but they had never truly believed them. Not until one of the attendants spoke up, sharing a conversation that would shake them to their core. This particular flight attendant, who had worked on Flight 401 before the crash, spoke of a conversation she'd had with Captain Loft just days before the fatal flight. She remembered how he seemed distant, off, as though something was weighing heavily on his mind. He had told her that something didn't feel right with the plane, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had a strange, haunted look in his eyes, a look that lingered long after the conversation ended. That night, the flight attendants came to a terrifying realization. Captain Loft, who had perished in the crash, might have known the danger they were facing all along. But if he had known, why hadn't he spoken up? Why hadn't he grounded the flight before it was too late? The theory of a cover-up gained more traction with each passing year. But one thing was clear. The spirits of Flight 401 weren't merely trying to reveal the truth of the crash. They were trying to warn those who would listen. This haunting wasn't just about lost souls. It was a message that something darker had taken place, something that had never come to light. As the years went by, the ghostly apparitions of Flight 401 became more than just a legend. They became a significant part of aviation history. The spirits of the flight crew continued to haunt planes, not as vengeful apparitions, but as guardians, warning the living of dangers too great to ignore. And so, the haunting of Flight 401 persists. For those who have encountered the spirits, the mystery remains unsolved. But for those who were there, those who were touched by the crash, one thing is certain: some ghosts are not content to rest in peace. They linger not out of a desire for revenge, but because they are trying to right the wrongs that no one else will acknowledge.